Hey everybody, KC here. So I recently went off on a rant in defense of middle managers. And basically my argument was if middle managers aren't getting the job done, the fault probably belongs to their bosses. Anyway, I got a lot of email about it, and one of the people I heard from is a guy named Jeff Sigel, who actually is the author of a book called The Middle Matters, a toolkit for middle managers. We had a really interesting conversation. We talk a lot about the specifics of the supermarket industry because there's a lot of middle managers in the supermarket industry and what both companies and people can do to make middle managers more effective and more efficient and bring more to the organization. It was a really interesting conversation, and I hope you'll enjoy it. Here's my conversation with Jeff Sigel, the author of The Middle Matters. Well, Jeff Sigel, welcome to Morning News Beat.
Thank you. Thanks, Kevin, for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
So the book is The Middle Matters, and it's a terrific book. And we first got connected because somebody you know who reads Morning News Beat saw the piece that I did, I don't know, a month or two ago
Right.
about middle management. And I was reacting to the idea that Amazon CEO Andy Jassy said he basically wanted to thin out the management ranks because he felt that they weren't as nimble as they should be, and they weren't as effective as they should be. And he thought by thinning out the management ranks, he could accomplish that. And the implication was it was the middle management ranks that were going to be thinned out.
Right.
And
Right.
and my response to that was that they may have been focusing on the wrong target. That if middle managers are not effective, that's actually in a lot of ways a failure of upper management. And so that was my first reaction to it. Your reaction to that?
Oh, well, so that was, I think, what I responded to you and when I shot you a note about it was absolutely agree with your take on this. I think that, I mean, there's so many articles recently, they're called things like the great unbossing or flattening organizations or whatever. And there's so many of these out there. People are trying to say, oh, we don't need this middle layer because they're not doing what they need to, what they need to do. So let's just get rid of them. They're just, creating this gap, basically they're just in between the senior management and the people that need to do stuff. And I think, I agree with you. It's sort of a fundamental misunderstanding of what the middle layers were, supposed to do. And it is often, I think, the result of the fact that we don't train the middle layer to really do their job. And so what happens is, yes, the middle layer appears to be, there's like a symptom of deleveraging the organization, right? If you believe that management is essentially what I like to call marionetting, where somebody at the top who, is brilliant and knows how to do everything is controlling all of the people and so forth. If you believe that, then yeah, I get it. Why do you need somebody in the middle to, to pull the strings you're already pulling? Except that's not how you get the most out of an organization, right? You get the most out of an organization by not by marionetting, but by activating all the brains of all the people that are in the organization underneath you. So the real value, in my view, of the middle manager is to help get the most out of those teams, but they have to be trained how to do it. And so if you don't train them, it looks like they're not doing anything. But I agree with you. That's a flaw at the top.
I can't. Are there are there any good senior executives out there who view themselves as being puppet masters and view their people as being marionettes? I can't imagine. It's hard for me to. I can't imagine working in an organization where I believe that I was just a marionette being manipulated.
Right.
But I can't imagine that there's any decent CEO who would think of themselves in those terms. I mean, can
Yeah, they
you?
don't. Yeah, no, and they don't, right? They don't think of it that way. What they think of it is, I am the internal view is, I am the only one who knows how to do this, who can save the day, whatever. They're not thinking I'm marionetting. They're thinking I know how to fix this. I know how to solve this problem, and nobody else knows, and so I have to tell them what to do. They don't actually think about. I don't know if you've ever read. There's a great book by an author named Liz Wiseman called Multipliers. And she talks about what she calls a multiplier, which is a leader that gets the most out of their team, gets people to really think and act independently, and that's how you really grow an organization. But she talks about the opposite of this as a diminisher, and her analogy for the diminisher is one brain with many hands. And I
Mhm.
think that I love that analogy because it's so true, and I see it all the time. I don't, maybe you've seen it as well in your career, but where people believe they are the only brain and everyone else is just the hands. That's that sort of marionetting that I was talking about before.
Yeah, and
I think,
you talk about multipliers in your
yeah,
book, and how it is by very definition it's exponential, right? And
right,
one plus one should equal three. If one plus one, if as a manager one plus one only equals two, you're
yeah.
not doing your job.
Right. And to some extent, I think when you try and sort of do the one brain's many hands, there's just like one plus one equals like a half, right? You're actually
Right.
decreasing the ability of the organization to, that's why she calls it a diminisher. You're diminishing the organization's ability to get things done, as opposed to if you can actually activate all the brains on the team. How do I get all of those brains functioning? Now I can get so much more. So it's not one brain, many brain, or one brain, many hands. It's just many brains, right? That's what I really want to get out of an organization. But you have to train people how to do it. If you
Sure.
don't,
Well,
it's
yeah,
like a natural default. I think that's why you see it, but people don't realize they're doing it. Is the natural default of an untrained manager is for most people is to try and marionette.
right. It's interesting because it seems to me in a lot of ways this is particularly an issue in the supermarket industry
Mm.
because it is just loaded with middle managers, right? There may be, I mean, I don't know if it's this would be true, but it seems to me that there'd be more, maybe more middle managers in the supermarket industry than almost any place else.
Yeah.
In the sense that even a store manager is a middle manager, a division manager could be a middle manager, not to mention the meat department manager and the produce man. I mean, they're just chock full of middle managers. And at least and I've been writing about the industry about 40 years, and my experience would tell me that in most cases, people who get promoted because they were able to do their jobs really well. So
Right.
a guy who's really good at working the meat counter gets made meat manager.
Right.
There's very little training in most organizations that goes into, okay, you're not just managing the meat, you're actually managing people, you're managing customers, you're managing, right? And there's no education around that.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. I would say somebody asked me the other day. I'm gonna be completely honest about my own management career for a second here. Is somebody asked me, Jeff, for throughout your career, we were talking about this whole point about sort of multipliers and diminishers and so forth, and this person asked me like, what kind of manager were you? And I said I would say for most of my career I was a benign over manager. I wasn't a micromanager, but I was probably way too involved. And for me, the thing that really like I always say to people, I could not have written my book without the job that I had for the last couple of years when I was working at Cracker Barrel, the restaurant company, where I was managing people that did things that I did not know how to do. And because I didn't know how to do them, for whatever reason, I just was like, oh, well, I gotta just focus with them on how do they grow their people and how do they, solve problems and remove obstacles and whatever. And that made me a better leader. And I think that, sort of the natural reaction, first of all, to your point, is people get promoted usually first. Managing people who do the thing that they were doing. To your point, I was I worked in the meat department. Now I'm the manager of the meat department. I worked in the accounting. Now I'm the manager of a bunch of accountants, right? And it's actually then this is where the natural inclination is, well, I got promoted because I'm really good at this, whatever accounting. So I'm going to try and get everybody to be sort of mini me's, right?
Right.
And so that's where that sort of marionetting we were talking about starts to play in is I'm trying to control everything so that everybody is delivering exactly what I was delivering. And you also have this heightened sense of anxiety of now I'm responsible for all this stuff and it needs to be the same quality that I was producing, right? So the best way to do this is to get everybody to do the same thing. What happens when you start to manage people that don't know when you don't know what they do is you can't do that anymore. And so some people try and it doesn't work. and other people sort of go, huh, maybe I wasn't doing this the right way. But I think you're right. It's interesting in the world of, multi-unit retail like grocery, or frankly in the restaurant industry, is as you move up in these roles, you are suddenly, you might have been, a great, meat manager or whatever. Now suddenly you're, a store manager. Now you have to manage all these other things. And so the question is, are you going to open-minded? I'm going to learn. I'm going to not believe, I'm going to stop with having this mindset of I know how to do this, and start having the mindset of I have people who know how to do this on my team, and I need to sort of learn from them and then help them to see where there may be gaps and so forth. But to your point, you have to train people to do that, because their natural inclination is to just be like, oh, I'm going to try and control all this stuff, because they feel a lot of anxiety, right? I'm now, all this responsibility is now on my shoulders. I've got to be able to deliver.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
no, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, it's interesting. USC has this fabulous program and they have a lot of fabulous programs. And one of it is where a lot of retailers from around the country, and CPG companies for that matter, send people to learn how to be leaders. And it's,
Hmm.
because obviously, by the way, managing and leading are two entirely different
Yep.
things.
Agree.
And
Yeah.
most people don't know. I mean, most people in the jobs don't know the difference, right?
Hmm. Right.
And I think that's really important, that company that you, and you've got a lot of companies, ranging from a lot of West Kroger, Albertsons, ShopRite here on the East Coast, that will take people and send them off for anywhere from 2 weeks to 3 months to say, you've got to learn. This is
Right.
you. If you're going to move up in this organization, you need some higher level of continuing education, if you will.
Yeah, I think, it's interesting, in the book I talk about three different roles that middle manager has, a doer, leader, and influencer. So, one of the things you mentioned, sort of that difference between managers and leaders and so forth, is I think the first thing that I've noticed is that people who are promoted into manager roles who have not been trained don't understand that their role has changed, right? My brother tells this story of somebody that he not long ago had coffee with, and she was in a new job, and she says to him, I love my new job. I just don't like the people stuff. It was like, well, that is your job, right? It's like people almost see the people stuff as some kind of somehow separate thing or whatever. And so I think for me, one of the things that I would start from is, do you understand now that you are a manager of people, that you now have three roles, and those roles are doer. That is, I've got it. You still have to get work done, right? You have to deliver results. And I always talk about the role of the doer as being really about the relationship between you and your manager, and that the goal of your relationship with your manager is to create enough credibility in yourself, for yourself, that your manager trusts you to get your job done.
Is
The second-
is it fair that uh, in terms of um, how you kind of separate out your time, if you are a manager, middle manager,
yeah,
that maybe anywhere from 60 to 70% of your time should be focused on the people side of the job, that right,
absolutely.
and maybe only 20 or 30% of the job should be focused on actually doing the work, if you will.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So that second role, that leader role that you're talking about, I tell people, I'm like, the goal of leadership is to create the conditions where you trust your team to get the work done at a very high level of quality, even when you're not there.
Right.
So in that sense, like
You
ideally,
tell a
what
great story about that in the book, about the woman who
absolutely.
was going off at the worst possible time, took 2 weeks off because her son was in the army, had leave. That was the only time she was going to be able to see him. And
Right. And her team functioned without her because she had trained them to. They didn't fall apart. They didn't need somebody sort of marionetting them or whatever. And so that is, to me, that story was really powerful for me to see from, from my perspective, even because, this woman was reporting to me. But I'm looking at this and going, wow, that's really true leadership is when you've gotten it so your team, you don't have to be involved. That's not to say that you never jump in. It's just but your team can function without you, which means that you get to focus on things like, how do I make this job easier for them? How do I help them learn and grow? How do I make sure that they are, feeling, engaged in their job? All of that stuff is what, but you don't need to be doing the work. You get out of it. And then I think, so I would say, if I look at your percentages, I mean, I would say maybe 20% of of your time should be spent, kind of in a middle management role, actually doing stuff. Probably about, I'm going to get my math wrong here, maybe 50% of your time, I would say you want to be spending, leading your team. And the last, whatever 30% of that, if those numbers work out, is the last 30% is all the third role, which is your influencing role, where you are talking to all these other people in the organization that don't report to you, that you don't report to, but you need things from them, they need things from you, and you have to basically be constantly creating a relationship so that when you need their help, um, because they, trust you and feel committed to you and so forth, that you are able to get that help, and vice versa. When they need help from you, you give it to them so that you are sort of, putting dollars in that, sort of trust bank, if you will.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, in there somewhere, and I don't know if it's in the influencer part of the Venn diagram or not, you've also got to manage up, right?
Yes.
Now, I've had a lot of exposure in my life to people who are really good at managing up and terrible at managing down.
Hmm.
Because all they want to do is satisfy the people above them with the eye of advancing their own careers and weren't really worried about the other stuff. And um I mean, I always think hey, listen, you got to there's a role for managing up. You've got to, because partially what you're doing, you're managing expectations. You're also
Right.
serving as a buffer between people above you and the people below you. Um, but it can't be somebody who's spending more time managing up than managing down is not doing the organization, not to mention
Right.
their people, any favors at all.
Yeah, so I would say, for me, I think of actually managing up as part of the doer role.
Right.
And the reason is because I always think of the doer role as the role of connection between you and your boss, right? And I say that in the book I talk about this idea that the role of the doer is to, again, to create credibility, right? And what you're trying to do is create a set of conditions where your boss trusts you to get work done without interfering. And so, a lot of that is how to, if you're not trying to jockey for position or try and get your boss, to sort of think you're great or whatever. Obviously, that's nice, and you want that to happen. But what you're really trying to do is create a set of conditions in which your boss trusts you so that you can run your team the way you need to if you have folks reporting to you. And so a lot of that managing up piece, I mean, I actually people, I don't know, it seems like there must be a lot of micromanagers out there because you hear about that a lot from people when I talk to people. And I always say to people, why does your boss micromanage you? And they're like, I don't know, they're mean. I don't know what it is. I'm like, no, your boss micromanages you because they're feeling insecure of themselves with
Right.
respect to their own boss. And so my recommendation to people when their boss is micromanaging them is, from a managing up perspective is you need to sort of, I call it feeding the beast. Just give them the details, give them what they're asking for to the point, to the point that they go, whoa, 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 I don't need all this information. I'm good, because again, they don't trust you because they don't trust themselves, right? So how do you actually get them to the point where they trust you? But that's, it's to your point of how, you should be spending time managing up in the sense that you should be creating that credibility. But when you have that credibility, don't don't then turn around and do the same thing to your own people.
Well,
Um,
I
you
would
know,
think that micromanagement or marionetting or whatever you want to call it,
right,
it's going to be like a virus, right? If you're my boss and you're doing that to me, I may resent it, but I'm probably doing the same thing to the people who work for me, and they're eventually going to do it to the same people who work for them because
exactly.
nobody's breaking the cycle. And
Right.
that seems to be a critical thing that businesses have to do.
Yeah, and so that's where I mean, I sort of view those two statements that I've sort of been talking about here. This idea of the goal of leadership is to essentially create the conditions where you trust your team, and the goal of managing up is to create the conditions where your boss trusts you. Is you actually are ideally in the middle, you're actually doing both of those things at the same time, right?
Yeah.
But I agree with you. If your boss doesn't trust you, then it is, they're going to be constantly telling you to do this, shifting your work, making you redo things and whatever, which creates a lot of frustration for the team because you end up being forced into a micromanaging position, and so to some extent you have to deal with that problem first, I think, where you need to make sure you've established trust with your boss so that you can do what you need to do with your team in the way that you want to do it, even if your boss, even if it's a totally different way than what your boss would do, to manage the team. I agree with you. You kind of have to intentionally break the cycle, but you have to know how to do it. If you don't train people to do it, then the cycle just perpetuates, and then you get that issue that you were talking about in the very beginning, which is people, senior leaders start to look at the middle and go, "What are these people doing?
Mm.
They're just." I'm micromanaging them and they're micromanaging the people. I can just micromanage their people.
Yeah.
That's not
So that would, yeah. The I'm curious. You're actually interesting because you've worked for both in the supermarket industry, vendors, and you
Mhm.
work for a retailer.
Yes.
Is there any? Do you have any sense just organizationally how they're different in terms of how they deal with the issues that we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's interesting in the manufacturing world that I came from, at least, on the marketing side or whatever. I mean, you're talking about many of the people in the manufacturing world are, at least in the corporate part of that, as opposed to in the plants and so forth, are just sort of managing from an office, et cetera. I guess I mean, actually, let me sort of answer this as the bigger difference that I see, instead of from industry to industry, is that probably from sort of whether or not you're talking about sort of corporate, kind of headquarters jobs versus field jobs. And so you mentioned this before, in a restaurant company, in a retail company, you have all these stores, and you have to naturally, like, if you want to get the most out of, every store, you can't have a headquarters person, in every store, trying to micromanage every store, all day long. And so you have to come up with ways to train your managers to lead stores when you're not there. So you kind of naturally have to do it. Whereas in headquarters roles, it's so much easier to be, kind of overly involved.
Do you
So,
want to let your dog into the office? Because
no, downstairs, I apologize.
I'll
Probably
just,
somebody dropping.
I got three. I've been there. They're just I'm safely ensconced to the other side of the house.
I
Um,
was like, I'm hoping that's not going through the microphone, but oh
no,
well.
it's fine. We love it. We love it. We love dogs here on Morning News Beat. Anyway, I'm just curious. So in the book, for middle managers out there, what are one or two or three things that you suggest that they could do? I'm not sure where the word is easily, but could do that could immediately impact their ability to manage.
Yeah, so I mean, these are gonna sound a little bit on the sort of theoretical, but they are the things that I've seen that seem to have the most immediate impact. So the first one is to understand their role. Middle manager, the biggest problem I think that I see with middle managers is they don't understand that their role has these three elements to it. And they need to understand that so that they can start to go, oh, okay, I need skills to be better at managing up, to be better at managing my team, and to be better at influencing other people in the organization. So having that, shifting that mindset. The second thing is taking ownership. I often tell people to that they need to have this mindset that something may not be your fault, but it is still your problem. Um, and having that mindset of, yes, like whatever, my boss is a micromanager, or my team is struggling, or whatever. Is the question is, how do you always stop yourself from blaming others, and look from the perspective of, um, what am I going to do about it? So that sort of ownership kind of approach of I am the one that can solve this problem, even if I didn't create this problem. And then the last piece is that I strongly believe in is this idea of creating in yourself and in your team a learning mindset. um, stop having this view that you should be able to get things perfectly and start having the view of, or that your team should do things perfectly and start having the view of, hey, everything that we do, right or wrong, failure, non-failure, whatever, is an opportunity to learn and get better. Because when teams do that, when leaders do that, when they create that environment, what happens is you see this sort of learning curve of everybody getting better and better all the time. Whereas if the view is, we can never make any mistakes, what happens is mistakes happen, but nobody ever learns from them because everybody's either trying to hide them, or they are embarrassed about them, or they don't want to talk about it, or it's punitive or whatever. It's like if you actually create a mindset with your team of, no, we're actually going to, every time something goes wrong, we're going to kind of look at this and say, okay, something went wrong. It's not the end of the world, but what are we going to do so that it doesn't happen next time? And what you'll find is that teams get better and better. So understand your role, take ownership, and create an atmosphere in which people are always learning. Those are the three things that I would strongly recommend to
But yeah,
middle.
always learning is a great place to end this. I have a lot of questions I could ask you, but it's interesting when you say it, because when you talk about that, it seems to me that one of the things that, and it kind of applies to a lot of what you were just talking about, middle managers who are not being trained by their organization can still
Yeah.
educate themselves. They can still learn,
Yeah.
and they can be better at their jobs, and quite frankly, create a path for themselves, a career path for themselves moving forward because they're better at their jobs. You can't just depend on your boss to educate you. You have a responsibility to educate yourself as well.
Uh, Absolutely. I think there's this tendency in the corporate world for people to sort of fall into this kind of victimization mode. Um, and you can actually, to your point, there's a lot more that people who are feeling like the world is happening to them, there's a lot more that they can do. One of the things that, I train people on this stuff, and one of the things that I always find fascinating is that one of the most sort of eye-opening things is I say to people that they can ask for feedback, and they're like, "Huh, never thought of that." I mean, it's just
No
like
figure.
so used to like being like, "Oh, I don't want to hear the feedback because if I hear the feedback, it's gonna, it might be something bad." I was like, "Well, if you're doing something bad, don't you want to know?"
Right.
Like it doesn't make it better because they didn't tell you. It actually makes it worse because they didn't tell you because you can't learn. So, things like that, actually, to your point, take charge of learning and always be in charge of your own growth. And then hopefully your company will do that as well. But if they don't, you still can grow.
Well, and a great place to begin that is with The Middle Matters by Jeff Sigel. It is available on Amazon. I will make sure I put a link in so people can order it. I hope we sell lots of copies for you. Jeff, thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it, and good luck with the book.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me on.
Take care.